Welcome to the topic Behaviorist Theories of Learning by Skinner. Module 1 Skinner's Operant Conditioning. Behavior is shaped and maintained by its consequences. It is operated by the organism and maintained by its results. The most influential behaviorist, B.F. Skinner, demonstrated many uses of operant conditioning. Skinner was an ardent practitioner of parsimony, always seeking simple explanations in terms of reinforcement histories rather than explanations in terms of mental states. Although we ordinarily expect scientific progress to emerge from a logical sequence of experiments designed to test certain hypotheses, it sometimes results from simple accident. For example, in one of Skinner's early experiments, he arranged for rats to run down an 8-foot-long alley to get food. After he grew tired of picking the rats up every time and returning them to the starting position, he built a circular runway. Now, the rats, after getting the food, could run around the circle and back to the start box on their own. But Skinner still had to replenish the food in the goal box each time. He rigged it so the rats could do that too. Eventually, he decided there was no need for the alley to the 8 feet long. In fact, he dispensed with the alley altogether. What was left was a simple box now called the Skinner box, in which a rat presses a lever or a pigeon pecks an illuminated disc or key to receive food. Shaping behavior. Suppose we want to train a rat to press a lever. If we simply put the rat in the box and wait, the rat might never press the lever. To avoid interminable waits, Skinner devised a powerful technique called shaping for establishing a new response by reinforcing successive approximations to it. To shape a rat to press a lever, we might begin by reinforcing the rat for standing up, a common behavior in rats. Before long, the rat has received several reinforcements and is beginning to stand up more frequently. Now we change the rules, giving food only when the rat stands up while facing in the general direction of the lever. Soon the rat spends much of its time standing up and facing the lever. It extinguishes its behavior of standing and facing any other direction because those responses are not reinforced. Now we provide reinforcement only when the rat stands in the part of the cage nearest the lever. Gradually, the rat moves closer and closer to the wall on which the lever is mounted. Then the rat must touch the lever and finally apply weight to it. Through a series of short, easy steps, the rat might progress from mere standing to actual lever pressing in a matter of minutes. Chaining behavior. To produce more complex sequence of behavior, psychologists use a procedure called chaining. Assume that you want to train an animal to go through a sequence of actions in a particular order. You want the animal to go through a wide sequence of actions and not to wait for a reinforcement after each one. You could chain the behaviors, reinforcing each one by the opportunity to make the next behavior. That is, first the animal learns the final behavior for some reinforcement, then it learns the next to last behavior which is reinforced by the opportunity to perform the final behavior, and so on. For example, a rat might first be placed on the top platform where it eats food. Then it is placed on the intermediate platform with a ladder in place to the top platform. It learns to climb the ladder. After it has done so repeatedly, it is placed on the intermediate platform, but the ladder is not present. The rat has to learn to pull a string to raise the ladder so that it can climb to the top platform. Finally, the rat is put on the bottom platform. It has to learn to climb the ladder to the intermediate platform, pull a string to raise the ladder, and then climb the ladder again. For each response in the chain, the reinforcement is the opportunity to engage in the next behavior until the final response in the chain leads to food. Humans learn to make chains of responses too. As an infant, you learn to eat with a fork and a spoon. Later, you learn to put your own food on the plate before eating. Eventually, you learn to plan a menu, go to the store, buy the ingredients, cook the meal, put it on the plate, and then eat it. Each behavior is reinforced by the opportunity to engage in the next behavior. To show how effective shaping and chaining can be, Skinner sometimes performed this demonstration. First, he trained a rat to go to the center of the cage. Then he trained it to do so only when he was playing a certain record. Then he trained it to wait for the record to start, go to the center of the cage, and sit up on its hind legs. Step by step, Skinner eventually trained the rat to wait for the record to start, move to the center of the cage, sit up on its hind legs, and then put its claws on a string next to a pole, pull the string to hoist a flag, and then salute the flag until the record had finished. Only then did it get its reinforcement. Needless to say, shows of patriotism are not part of a rat's natural repertoire of behaviors. It learns to go through the motions only by successive approximations. Operant. Skinner considers an operant as an act which constitutes an organism's doing something. For example, raising the head, walking about, pushing a lever, etc. Reinforcer and reinforcement. The concept of reinforcement is identical to the presentation of a reward. A reinforcer is a stimulus, the presentation or removal of which increases the probability of a response being repeated. Skinner recognizes two kinds of reinforcers, positive and negative. A positive reinforcer is any stimulus such as food, water, sexual contact, etc., the introduction or presentation of which increases the likelihood of a particular behavior. In the educational context, praise, grades, medals, and other prizes awarded to the students are examples of positive reinforcers. A negative reinforcer is any stimulus, the removal or withdrawal of which increases the likelihood of a particular behavior. An electric shock, a loud noise, etc. are said to be negative reinforcers. In the educational context, one example may be teachers saying to the students that whoever does drill work properly in the class would be exempted from homework. Negative reinforcers and punishment. These two terms should not be taken that have the same meaning. Whereas reinforcers, positive as well as negative, strengthen behavior, punishment weakens it. Punishment has consequences which are not reinforcing or do not strengthen behavior and aims at reducing behaviors by imposing unwelcome consequences. On the other hand, negative reinforcers strengthen desirable behavior by withdrawing unpleasant experiences. Here, it should be noted that for a measure to be called a punisher, it should invariably seek to reduce the frequency of a behavior by the imposition or introduction of unpleasant consequences. For example, in the case of a student who feels pleased about being outside the class, instead of feeling bad, to turn him out of the class would not act as a punisher or a means of behavior modification. Similarly, for students who like being scolded because it gains them their teacher's attention and or enhances their status among their peers, the scolding instead of working as a punisher is likely to prove to be a reinforcer of their behavior. Module 2, the schedules of reinforcement. Skinner put forward the idea of planning of schedules of reinforcement for conditioning the operant behavior of the organism. Some important schedules are continuous reinforcement schedule. This is a now turned out reinforcement schedule where provision is made to reinforce or reward every correct response of the organism during acquisition of learning. For example, a student may be rewarded for every correct answer he gives to the questions or problems put forth by his teacher. Fixed interval reinforcement schedule. In this schedule, the organism is rewarded for a response made only after a set interval of time, for example, every 3 minutes or every 5 minutes. How many times he has given correct responses during this fixed interval of time doesn't matter. It is only at the expiry of the fixed interval that he is presented with some reinforcement. Fixed ratio reinforcement schedule. In this schedule, the reinforcement is given after a fixed number of responses. A rat, for example, might be given a pellet of food after a certain number of liver presses. A student may be properly rewarded after he answers a fixed number of questions, say 3 or 5. The fixed ratio schedule is used in some factories and by employers of casual workers or laborers where wages are paid on piecework basis, that is, the number of garments sewn or number of baskets or boxes packed. Variable reinforcement schedule. When reinforcement is given at varying intervals of time or after a varying number of responses, the individual doesn't know when he is going to be rewarded, and consequently he remains motivated throughout the learning process in the hope of reinforcement. The most common example of such a schedule in human behavior is the reinforcement operation schedules of gambling devices. Here rewards are unpredictable and keep the players well motivated through occasional returns. Reinforcement and its schedules play a key role in the conditioning of operant behavior and acquisition of learning. Where a continuous reinforcement schedule increases the response rate, the discontinuance of reinforcement may result in the extinction of that response or behavior. A continuous reinforcement schedule thus yields the least resistance to extinction and the lowest response rate during learning. Learning of a response, therefore, occurs quickly if every correct response is rewarded, but it is forgotten easily when the reinforcement is stopped. If reinforcement is given after a varying number of correct responses or at varying intervals of time, the responses is remarkably resistant to extinction. However, the fixed interval reinforcement schedules are found to provide the lowest yield in terms of performance, as the individual may soon learn to respond correctly only when the time or turn of reinforcement arrives. Similarly, he may lose interest in getting reinforcement after a fixed interval or fixed number of correct responses. Weighing all this properly, Skinner suggests a 100% schedule to begin with, followed by a fixed interval or fixed ratio schedule to finally arrive at the variable reinforcement schedule for better results in learning or training. Defining operant conditioning. Operant conditioning refers to a kind of learning process where a response is made more probable or more frequent by reinforcement. It helps in the learning of operant behavior, the behavior that is not necessarily associated with a non-stimulus. Module 3, distinction between classical and operant conditioning. Classical or respondent conditioning is based on respondent behavior. Specifically, it deals with responses that invariably follow a specific stimulus and are thus elicited, for example, blinking at a bright light, jumping at an electric shock, salivation to the taste of food, and so forth. In this, greater importance is attached to the stimulus for eliciting the desired response. That is why it is also called a type S conditioning. On the other hand, operant conditioning helps in conditioning or learning of operant behavior that is emitted rather than elicited. The organism seems to initiate operant behavior on his own without a single explicit preceding stimulus. In this type of learning, much emphasis is placed on the response rather than the stimulus causing the response. This is why it is also named as type R conditioning. In type S conditioning, the problem with the trainer or teacher is to select appropriate stimuli for evoking desired response. On the other hand, in R-type conditioning, out of many responses which an organism is capable of giving, the problem with the trainer or teacher is to evoke only the appropriate responses and then fix them properly with the help of suitable reinforcement. The difference between these two types of conditioning thus may be summarized as below. Difference between classical and operant conditioning. In the first case, it helps in the strengthening of elicited response, that is respondent behavior. But in the second case, it helps in the strengthening of emitted response, that is operant behavior. In the first case, it is an S-type conditioning where emphasis is given to the stimulus. But in the second case, it is an R-type conditioning where emphasis is given to the response. For the first case, conditioned response and unconditioned response are the same, that is salivation. But for the second case, conditioned response and unconditioned response are different. Pressing the lever is conditioned response and eating food is unconditioned response. In the first case, there is definite connection between stimulus and response. But in the second case, conditioned response cannot be connected with any non-stimulus. For the first case, pairing is between unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus, whereas in the second case, pairing is between a response and the reinforcing stimulus which follows. In the first case, bond between unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus is established, whereas in the second case, tendency to respond in a specific manner is developed. For the first case, focus is on the single SR bondage, but in the second case, it is concerned with sequences of responses. For the first case, it is stimulus substitution is the essence of learning, whereas in the second case, response modification is the essence of learning. In the first case, strengthening of bones by repetition promote learning, but in the second case, reinforcement promotes learning. Module 4, Implications of the theory of operant conditioning. Theory of operant conditioning has revolutionized the field of training or learning by putting forward the following practical ideas and implications. A response or behavior is not necessarily dependent or contingent upon a specific non-stimulus. It is more correct to think that a behavior or response is dependent upon its consequences. Therefore, for training an organism to learn a particular behavior or response, it may be initiated to respond in such a way as to produce a reinforcing stimulus. The individual's behavior should get the reward and he should in turn act in such a way that he is rewarded again and so on. Therefore, the learning or training process and environment must be so designed as to create the minimum frustration and the maximum satisfaction in learners to provide him with proper reinforcement for the desired training or learning. The principle of operant conditioning may be successfully applied in behavior modification. We have to find something which is rewarding for the individual whose behavior we wish to modify, wait until the desired behavior occurs and immediately reward him when it does. When this is done, the frequency with which the desired response occurs goes up. When the behavior next occurs, it is again rewarded and the rate of response goes up even further. Proceeding in this manner, we can induce the individual to learn the desired behavior. When this is done, the frequency with which the desired response occurs goes up. When the behavior next occurs, it is again rewarded and the rate of response goes up even further. Proceeding in this manner, we can induce the individual to learn the desired behavior. The development of human personality can be successfully manipulated through operant conditioning. The theory of operant conditioning does not attribute motivation to internal processes within the organism. It takes for granted the consequences of a behavior or response as a source of motivation to further occurrence of that behavior. Food is a reinforcer to a rat or a pigeon. Knowledge of the correct response is a reinforcement to a learner. Secondary reinforcers also prove very important sources of motivation for a learner. Verbal praise, positive facial expressions of the trainer or teacher, a feeling of success, high scores, good grades, prizes, medals, and the opportunity to do work one likes are all good motivators. Operant conditioning thus provided an external approach to motivation. Operant conditioning emphasizes the importance of schedules in the process of reinforcement of behavior. In trying to impart or teach a particular behavior, therefore, great care should be taken for the proper planning of the schedules of reinforcement. This theory advocated the avoidance of punishment for unlearning the undesirable behavior and for shaping the desirable behavior. Punishment proves ineffective in the long run. It appears that punishment simply suppresses behavior, and when the threat of punishment is removed, the rate with which the behavior occurs returns to its original level. Therefore, operant conditioning experiments suggested appropriate alternatives to punishment in the form of rewarding appropriate behavior and ignoring inappropriate behavior for its gradual extinction. In its most effective application, the theory of operant conditioning has contributed a lot to the development of teaching machines and programmed learning. The theory of operant conditioning has shown that learning proceeds most effectively if the learning material is so designed that it produces fewer chances for failure and more opportunities for success. The learner is given rapid feedback concerning the accuracy of his learning, and the learner is able to learn at his own pace. The principles originating from operant conditioning have revolutionized the training and learning programs. As a result, mechanical learning in the form of teaching machines and computer assisted instructions has taken root in place of usual classroom instruction. Let us summarize the main ideas we have discussed in this session before concluding the topic. This unit has given description of one of the major behaviorist theories, Skinner's operant conditioning. It includes Skinner's experiment, shaping and chaining of behavior, and reinforcement schedules. The unit also provides the details of the distinction between classical and operant conditioning and also the educational implications of operant conditioning. Now, you can try to answer the questions given here. Define operant conditioning. What is the difference between negative reinforcement and punishment? Explain various schedules of reinforcement. Explain the process of chaining in operant conditioning. Explain the process of shaping behavior. Why does operant conditioning called R-type conditioning? Now you can go through these books for further reference. Hilgard and Bower G.H. in the year 1975, Theories of Learning, 4th edition, New Jersey, Prentice Hall. Hulse, H.S., Dees, J. and Eggert H. in the year 1975, The Psychology of Learning, 4th edition, McGraw-Hill. Mangal S.K. in the year 2004, Advanced Educational Psychology, 2nd edition, New Delhi, Prentice Hall of India. Thank you for watching this program. We may meet again with another topic. Have a nice day.